In this lecture, we're going to explore the basic anatomy and introduce the functionality of the cerebellum. And the major function of the cerebellum is that it regulates movement and posture indirectly. And how it carries this out is by adjusting the output from the motor cortices, as addressed in the previous video. And so to understand the function of the cerebellum is to examine its output in cases where there are cerebellar lesions. And so in the event where there are problems with the cerebellum, the motor output is actually retained as signals coming from the motor cortices continue. However, those signals are not as coordinated. So coordinated complex movements do become impaired. And that is a sign of perhaps cerebellar ataxia. And this is a condition in which movements lack coordination between body parts. And it's usually referenced to a particular part of the body or a particular function, such as gait or just basic walking or arm movements. And the question of how the cerebellum carries out a task, such as pictured here on the bottom right-hand corner as this person's reaching out for a cup of coffee, is that the cerebellum acts as a comparator. And so it compares the intended movement with the actual movement. And to do this, it does require sensory feedback from the moving limb. The second way in which the cerebellum carries out its function is to modify what are called central motor programs. And these are patterns of neuron activation that can be reliably repeated to carry out particular complex tasks. And the cerebellum, the goal of the cerebellum output is to minimize movement errors. And this is typically involved in the learning of new motor tasks. When we take a look at the surface anatomy of the cerebellum, there are some unique features that are quite similar to the brain, to the hemispheres, and there are some certainly unique differences as well. So we see the cerebellum is organized into a right and left hemisphere, as we saw with the cerebrum. What is unique from with the cerebellum is that it contains these folia, these folds, if you will, that give the cerebellum a unique texture and appearance. So the folia are these transverse convolutions, and they appear on the surface. Through the midline, there is what's called a vermis, and it's an actual strip of tissue. So the difference with the cerebrum, which has a longitudinal fissure, a very deep groove that separates the right and left hemispheres from each other, the vermis is not a deep groove, but it's actually a strip of tissue that divides the cerebellum into right and left hemispheres. In terms of the internal anatomy, what we see here is a cross-section of the cerebellum. And what's pictured here is a very thick cerebellar cortex. Contrast this with the cerebral cortex, the surface portion of the cerebrum, but that layer is quite thinner than it is with the cerebellum. In a similar manner, we see a series of deep located cell clusters of cell body neurons, just simply referred to as the deep cerebellar nuclei. And the white region here, or the white matter, are the axons that connect the cortex and the deep nuclei that you see located throughout this deep region of the cerebellum. So the deep cerebellar nuclei, not quite as clear on this picture, but we'll see it on the next one. There are three pairs of the deep cerebellar nuclei, And in terms of their position, medial to lateral, if we divide the cerebellum cross section down a midline here, the fastigious is the most medial. The interposed or interpositus uh, uh, nuclei is the middle one, as it's quote unquote interposed, and the dentate is the most lateral set of neurons located in this region. And the function of these deep cerebellar nuclei is that these are the outputs of the cerebellum. And the outputs include the vestibular nuclei located in the brain stem. Now, for the output to happen, this region must receive inputs as well. And what's unique about these nuclei is that inputs come from a wide range of locations of the central nervous system. And so the afferent pathways will synapse not just onto the cortex, but also onto the deep cerebellar nuclei. So there are inputs that do come in, and as we saw with the cerebrum, the cerebellum is informed of the state of the body in terms of limb position and limb movement. In terms of the outflow of the deep cerebellar nuclei, what we see here, and I'll just highlight this with the red, here we see the most laterally located dentate nuclei. And when these neurons are active, bioelectrical signals will project to motor and the premotor cortices. And this function appears to work in terms of coordinating motor planning. The interposed cluster of nuclei that you see here, these will project to lateral descending systems. And so when we talk about descending systems, these are bioelectrical signals traveling inferior along the spinal cord, where eventually will synapse onto lower motor neurons. And since it's lateral, these would tend to affect muscles in the peripheral limbs, the more distally located muscles. This region of nuclei will also, or rather the internal portion, most inner portion, most medial fastigial nuclei will project to the medial descending systems. And we know that these systems, when activated, lead to motor execution. And it does so by synapsing eventually with the lower motor neurons or the alpha motor neurons. The cerebellum is also divided up into 3 unique lobes as well, and those lobes are differentiated here with the different colors. And so the purple identifies the most anterior positioned lobe, and hence named the anterior lobe. The posterior lobe is, of course, posterior to the anterior, but also extends into a more inferior position, and it's by far the largest of the 3 lobes. Separating these 2 lobes, as you can see here, clearly identified by the green and the purple, is the primary fissure. The flocculonodular lobe is the smallest. As you can see here, is just superior to the most inferior part of the posterior lobe of the cerebellum. And this is a sagittal plane or side view cross section of the cerebellum, and a posterior view, as you can see here, the anterior lobe appears to have more of a superior position, slightly superior, but the most inferior, of course, is the flocculonodular lobe. And the posterolateral fissure is the small groove that separates the posterior from the flocculonodular lobe. The cerebellar vermis itself, as you can see in this study published in 2011, focused on providing additional anatomical detail, not just to the cerebellum, but to the midline tissue. And the lobes, what the study found is that the lobes of the cerebellum are divided into lobules and are numbered according to Roman numerals, where the anterior lobe is made up of lobules numbered from 1 to 5, the posterior lobe numbered from 6 to 9, and the flocculonodular lobe, which is only defined as having one nodule by itself, and that is identified by Roman numeral 10. And the numbers are so applied in a superior to inferior manner. And these projections, these receive projections from the cerebral motor cortex and will terminate onto lobules 5 to 8, specifically in the vermis. And so what we see here is that the cerebral cortex does play a role in influencing the descending control of whole body posture and gait. So overall, the cerebellum is a portion of the brain that is very much involved in the maintenance of upright posture and maintaining an accurate form of gait, but that role is coordinated with the output from the cerebral cortex. So this ends our second video on the cerebellum.